Hi, I'm Elaine Engelhart from Utah Valley State, and I'd like to welcome all of you to class today. It's our fourth class period, and today we'll be looking at an ethics system that comes from Sermon on the Mount, New Testament. In other class periods, we've looked at the nature of ethics, and also we've discussed in our last class period the Ten Commandments and how this Judeo-Christian ethic is often a strong place to start in the discussion of ethics. We've looked at how this is a system that is a divine command theory and how this is different from a natural ethics system. And to help us with our discussion today is Dennis Potter, and Dennis is an assistant professor of philosophy and a good friend. And welcome, Dennis. Glad you're here.
Thank you very much.
And the students who are visiting with us today are John and Rhonda. Thanks for being here, and Kisper and Luke. So welcome. And hope that you'll just jump right in the discussion and make our students at home feel like they're getting a very good discussion on this important subject. So Dennis, I think we probably need to start off with a transition on Ten Commandments and Sermon on the Mount, that some folks call Sermon on the Mount the higher law, that it's higher than the Ten Commandments. Tell me what you think about that notion.
Well, I think that I think that's a common notion. It's a common notion that the ethics that Jesus is portraying in the New Testament is superseding the previous law. I don't think that that's right, and I think there's actually a passage in the Sermon on the Mount that indicates that it's rather to fulfill the law rather than to supersede it. I think the best way to put it is that Jesus is deepening and radicalizing the earlier Jewish law, not actually contradicting it or superseding it.
You know, I like the way you put that, because this is a radical philosophy, isn't it? There are many respects where people today can't even, who do say they're Christians, can't obey this very radical philosophy. And it just has different elements to it that bring that about. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think someone who really followed the Sermon on the Mount would radically transform their lives. I mean, it would be if we all followed this, society would be significantly different in its structure and in culture and so on.
We probably wouldn't be having wars.
Yeah, probably not.
Yeah, it's a very interesting and lovely philosophy. Luke, you want to tell me anything that you see with the transition between the two, Sermon on the Mount and the Ten Commandments?
I think one thing that strikes me is that with the Ten Commandments you have more of commandments. Thou shalt not do the following, and it's a very negative connotation. Do not do this, basically. Here you have more do this, and it's more open-ended to where there's a greater degree of interpretation, like we spoke about in the last episode on the Ten Commandments. You know, in the Old Testament, it's not simply those 10 commandments, but many other laws that go along with them to clarify different situations. And here you have more of figure it out on your own to a certain extent.
Okay, thanks. Kisper, anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I feel like it gives more of a chance to build character, whereas the 10 Commandments are a strict set of rules that you must follow, or must do and must not do. But the Sermon on the Mount gives you room to grow and become better in your character as a moral person.
Okay, thanks. How about you, Rhonda and John?
Well, following the higher law would be in a lot of measure of taking the higher road. There are things in the Sermon on the Mount that indicates more love towards one's neighbor as opposed to living with one's neighbor.
Okay, very good. And John, how about you?
I think in last class period it was important to note that the Ten Commandments appear rather simple and straightforward, but they're still really complex, and there's a lot of argument about how we apply them to our lives. And I think the Sermon on the Mount is going to open that up even more, because they're not as simple and straightforward, and there's a lot of talk in this one that is going to be open to interpretation. And we saw that with the Ten Commandments. We're going to see it even more here.
Okay, very good. So, Dennis, as we're looking at these, we see that we're challenged to not only not kill someone, we're challenged to not even get angry. And so, you know, we'll be moving into these aspects where maybe we have some more complexity, but it's pretty direct again, isn't it, in what this ethics system is?
Yeah, I think one of the things to look at is that you can see the Old Testament, or sorry, the Ten Commandments as laws, and you're supposed to act in accordance with these laws, and it doesn't really matter what your intention is, it doesn't really matter what your character is, as long as you're living according to the law. But there's much more of an emphasis on character and intention in the Sermon on the Mount, and so there's a de-emphasis on legalism, I think.
I think so too. Another aspect of this, once again, this is an interdisciplinary class, and I think that it's very easy to read Sermon on the Mount as a beautiful piece of literature, as a piece of history, as philosophy or religion, that it can fit into any areas, and that a well-educated person should understand it and know where it's found. And just to add a point to that, quite often I'll ask my students, where is Sermon on the Mount found, and it is the strong ethic given by Jesus Christ, and many of them haven't heard of that before. So you want to comment on any of those insights?
Well, yeah, I think that you can't read the Sermon on the Mount just as a philosophical text giving arguments for a certain ethical position. You have to read it as a literary text, and one that has historical roots as well. You've got to look at it from the point of view that the religious followers would have looked at it, comparing it to other texts, like, for example, the Sermon on the Plain, which has some very similar aspects to it. That's the text in Luke 6. So yeah, I think you have to take an interdisciplinary approach to a text like this. You can't look at it the way you would look at John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism or something like that.
Very good. Anyone else like to comment on this? And so remember, students, you will get a test question on this asking you where is Sermon on the Mount found, which is Matthew 5 through 7. And those will be the chapters that we'll be looking at today. So any thoughts that you'd like to say about the interdisciplinary nature of this, Luke or Kisper? Okay, well, one area where you really do see the beauty of it is in the Beatitudes. And John, maybe if I could just ask you to read chapters 1 through 8, page 13 in your textbook, students.
Chapters 1 through 8 or
Excuse me, verses 1. Yeah, we're going to do a lot of reading today.
And seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain, and when he was set, his disciples came unto him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God.
Let's have you go through 11.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake.
Okay, so he gives these blessings. What does beatitude mean? What do these blessings mean, Dennis?
Well, he's trying to identify, I think, those who are going to enjoy the blessings of the kingdom that he's initiating in this dispensation. So he's identifying, to some extent, those for whom he has a preference. This isn't an ethics that says that everyone's okay. This is one that says that some people are in a better position with respect to God than others. It's important to look at the historical context here too, and recognize that Matthew's writing almost 100 years after Christ dies, or the author of Matthew, whoever that is writing almost 100 years after Christ dies. And there's a history to some of these sayings that are found in the Beatitudes. And that history indicates to us, for example, that probably Matthew added in spirit after the word poor. The Greek word that's used for the word poor is one that clearly indicates an economic status. In fact, it's an economic status of absolute destitution. It's not just typical poor. It's not just someone living in a trailer park. It's absolute destitution. It's the people on the margins of society. And to say that they are the ones who are blessed, they're the ones who are going to inherit this kingdom, that that Jesus is initiating is a pretty radical statement. And so this would be shocking to his audience, I think, even his disciples.
Okay, good point. And Rhonda, what do you think about adding those words? Why do you think maybe Jesus Christ, who did the speaking, and then Matthew, who did the writing of it, we assume it's Matthew who did the writing, that Jesus Christ might have said, "Blessed are the poor"? And why might that be very consistent with what Jesus Christ says throughout throughout Sermon on the Mount?
Well, we know that those who followed Jesus Christ were typically the poor. The rich had not much to do with Christ. They didn't need him. Those who were poor, whether it was economically or their spirits had fallen. They were the ones who needed the uplift, who needed something to look forward to, something to enrich their lives with.
Very good. And John, we see a very egalitarian system with Jesus Christ. We see where he sees all of us as equal. He doesn't see the wealthy as better than the poor. And so what might be another aspect to this egalitarian system?
Well, I think that he is talking about a way of life where we are all living very communal lifestyles, and we're all living together rather than against each other. And economic status does do a lot to create contention between people. And I think that in a lot of ways he's saying this is not the way it's supposed to be. This contention created by economic status isn't supposed to exist, or I prefer that it doesn't.
He wants cooperation between us. He doesn't
Absolutely.
want competition. So, and these Beatitudes are saying, I'm looking for people who know how to cooperate. I'm looking for the peacemakers. I'm looking for those who can be humble. Yeah, thanks. These are all good insights. Kisper.
One thing that I like about these is that they're characteristics that he highlights later on, meek and pure in heart and peacemakers. He highlights those later on in the text, and he's giving a list of the rewards that they will receive for the things that they do and the people that they become.
Okay, thank you very much. And Luke, anything you'd like to add to this?
Just on that same point, I think it's interesting that going back to the Ten Commandments, we see there are blessings attached, especially when you look at the version of them in Deuteronomy where there's a little more explanation. There are blessings attached, but here we have blessings for everything that he's saying. There's a blessing that he's laying out for everything that he talks about here.
Okay.
Can I add one more
Yes, please
point
do,
to this
Dennis.
about the Beatitudes? It might be tempting sometimes, I think, for people to read the Beatitudes in the way that it says, well, the people who are poor in this life, don't worry, you're going to inherit the kingdom of God in the next life. And that opens it up for a criticism that Marx is going to later give us, which I'm sure we'll talk about later in the course. And that is that religion can have a tendency to keep people oppressed rather than liberate them. But I think that it's clear in the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus intends his kingdom to be initiated now. Because in the Lord's Prayer, which is later in the Sermon on the Mount, it says, as it is in heaven, here on earth, right? And so it points out that the kingdom is supposed to be something that he's initiating, and that the poor inheriting that kingdom, that should be now. That should be in this life as well as in the next.
Very good.
Can I add one other thing, Elaine?
Please do, Rhonda.
Lots of times, these characteristics are often seen as weaknesses, or for instance, the meek, the peacemakers, those kinds of characteristics are often seen by a lot of people simply by just being weak, where these are actually strengths. Just as this is an aside.
and he's privileging them as strengths. Thank you.
Right.
John?
I was going to say, later when we talk about Nietzsche, he's going to make this criticism that, Jesus is going to be talking to the oppressed people, and they are going to have these certain characteristics like meekness, and he's going to question whether or not they should be viewed as strengths, and I think that question should remain open. So.
Thanks. Very good. Anything anyone would like to add to that? Well, let's go ahead and move on just a little bit more with this concept of the higher law and pull up that first graphic. And Kisper, would you read this for us, please?
Why is it called the higher law? It deals with the attitudes rather than actions.
Okay, and let's move right on into an example of this with the first scripture that we have, Matthew 5:21 and 22. And Luke, would you read that for us?
Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you, that whosoever is angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whosoever shall say to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council.
Okay, thanks. Dennis, why is this so important? Why does he start with this point about, I don't even want you to get angry, let alone I don't want you to kill?
Well, I think he's trying to get at the intention behind the law, and not just the legalism involved in the law, and trying to teach his disciples to learn that the law is there to help them become better people. The law is there for human beings, not human beings for the law. And so he's identifying the reason why we would have such a law, and that is to keep us from being alienated from one another. If you've murdered someone, you have, long before you even murdered them, you've hated them, and you've been alienated from them. And you might even define sin in the New Testament as the state of alienation between persons, and that seems to come out fairly well in the Sermon on the Mount.
It does, and in fact, as we're reading a little bit further in this, if you turn to page 14, and you'll see on verse 25, he says, agree with thine adversary quickly while thou art in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge. And he's kind of saying, and then you can get cast into prison. He's going to say, you know, there are all kinds of problems that can happen when you move into an adversarial relationship. So it's as true then as it is today, or it's as true today as it was then, saying, if you start an adversarial relationship and you can't let it go, you know, you could end up being the one in prison, not your adversary.
Yeah, and this theme of alienation between persons actually fits fairly well with the Beatitudes, because those are the people who are most alienated from society, the people who are the poor, the people who are hungry, and the people who are persecuted for their advocacy of justice. And so, you know, these tie together, the Beatitudes and the later antitheses, where he's showing the real intention behind the law. They tie together through this theme of alienation, that the purpose of the law, the purpose of God, in fact, is to bring people together, not to have them divide.
Okay, thank you. Any comments from the students on these? John?
I think it's interesting to note, I mean, he's talking about adversarial relationships, and if we applied that today, and in current political situations, not entering into an adversarial relationship has huge consequences in the way that we deal with other countries and so on. And should we really be retaliating against wrongs done to us? And I think we're also going to get into that when we get into the turn the other cheek, but I think it's directly applicable to political situations today.
It really is. And once again, it comes down to this very radical teaching given to us by Jesus Christ.
I was just thinking, it's interesting that in the United States, our court system is adversarial. None of it is to go and to settle things. It's, you know, one against the other. You always have a loser. You don't ever have just everybody wins. It's never a win-win situation. I find it interesting in this Christian country that we live in, our court system is adversarial.
Okay, and it's how we do things. Kisper?
I'd like to also bring up the point that oftentimes and most times our thoughts and our attitudes lead to our actions. So by saying don't even be angry with your brother, Christ is saying that he's providing a barrier before you even get to the point of killing and murdering, that you stop that attitude before it happens.
Okay, and he's going to reiterate this some more, but he's also going to apply this to adultery. And let me have you read these next few verses for us. And this is going to be verses 27 and 28, Kisper.
Verses 27 and 28?
Uh-huh.
Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, that thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her, hath committed adultery with her already in his heart.
Okay, and once again, we're seeing perhaps a higher law, or he's giving the standard on this. Dennis, some comments on this for us?
Well, I think this one's interesting because the law that says you shouldn't commit adultery doesn't really, I don't know, it only focuses on action. It doesn't focus on attitudes. In this case, when he says, well, you shouldn't even lust after a woman, I think it's important that he's talking to the man, saying the man should not lust after the woman. Because I think there's a tendency in their society, which is a sexist society at the time, and there's a tendency in our society, which is clearly similarly sexist, although not quite as much, to objectify women as sex objects. And I think that this is essentially Jesus is saying something along the lines of that we shouldn't objectify women as sex objects. They're persons. They should be seen as persons. And adultery is just kind of the, something that comes out of that. But maybe the more fundamental sin is the objectification of women.
Thank you. In fact, quite often when we're looking at different categories of ethics, such as duties, rights, utility, virtue, and relationship, we put Jesus Christ right into the relationship ethic because he's very concerned about love. He's very concerned about the way we treat one another, and in many aspects he's seen as a feminist by scholars.
Oh, yeah. He's much more concerned about women than people were at the time. I mean, he interacts with them much more often and in ways that are actually socially taboo.
Okay, very good. And Luke?
I just think it's interesting in light of what we've been talking about to note that the Greek word for repentance, if I remember right, has to do with changing thought or changing the way you're thinking, if you were to literally translate it. And here we have in the New Testament, which was written in Greek, we have an emphasis on thoughts and ideas and not just actions. It's interesting to see that change in light of, kind of redefining both sin and, as a result, repentance.
Okay, thank you. And let's go ahead and pull up our next graphic. And Rhonda, would you read this for us on relationships?
The Sermon on the Mount emphasizes relationships in this life. The spirit of the law is preferred over the letter of the law.
Okay, so once again, Dennis, this just reiterates some of the very strong messages that you've been giving us about Jesus Christ and his focus on human beings, his focus on making sure that we're looking after the least of these, and we're really caring about one another as well. Well, let's go ahead and look just a little bit more at how he's going to say we really have to avoid hatred. And he's already said, don't even get angry, let alone don't kill. But now he's going to give you some more advice on it. So let's go from Matthew 5:38 through 45. And this is going to tell us a little bit more about how important it is to love our neighbor. And John, would you read this for us, please?
Ye have heard that it hath been said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, that ye resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if any man will sue thee at the law, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also. And whosoever shall compel thee to go a mile, go with him twain. Give to him that asketh thee, and from him that would borrow of thee, turn not thou away. Ye have heard that it hath been said, Thou shalt love thy neighbor, and hate thine enemy. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you, that ye may be the children of your Father which is in heaven. For he maketh his sun to rise on the evil and on the good, and sendeth rain on the just.
Those are very powerful verses. And Rhonda, do you think we can behave that way? Can you love your enemies and bless them that curse you and despitefully use you? Can you turn the other cheek?
I think all of us turn the other cheek quite often. Otherwise, if we didn't, we'd all be in jail. What I was saying a minute ago, I think that all of us would like our neighbors to treat us in the ways that Jesus is saying here, and in turn, we would treat them the same.
Very good, and we do have Jesus Christ giving us the golden rule on this. So it is pretty controversial. Do you think that you can be one of Jesus's followers on this, John?
I'd like to think so, but it's difficult, that's for sure.
They say that in the top 10 philosophers, Jesus always makes the top 10, but kind of lower to the bottom because his followers can't keep these commandments. So does it get a little troublesome at times, Kisper?
It does. I remember when I was a child, though, something my mother told me, and it fits very well with this. When I'd come home upset because someone was being mean to me, she'd say, the best thing you could do is just be nice back and say something kind to them or give them a compliment. And every time someone would say something cruel to me, and as a kid I would say something nice back to them, it would shock them and it would take them back. And after that, if either I would not have an enemy or I would have a new friend. And it was amazing how it worked. It's too bad that we can't all be a little more childlike and do those kind of things. It's harder as an adult, I think, to forgive.
Do you think Jesus Christ was kind of hoping for those kind of reactions? Was he giving us some advice?
Well, I think that
extra advice,
I think
maybe.
You got to remember, Matthew is writing at a time when the Roman Empire is especially oppressive, and I think that because of that, these passages can be read in two different ways. And he's hoping, I think, that people in Rome are going to read it one way, namely the way that we've been reading it, that, oh, well, we're just going to lie down and you can do whatever you want to us. But I think really he's telling his followers to engage in acts of disobedience. If you turn your other cheek when someone backhands you, they're not going to be able to backhand you again. If a Roman centurion takes away your jacket and you give him your cloak as well, you're going to be naked in public, that's pretty disobedient. And it was a law in the Roman Empire that the soldiers could only make one of the citizens carry, or someone like a Jew carry something for them for 1 mile. So if you keep on going and go the extra mile, you're actually forcing that soldier to break the law. And of course, Jesus' ministry, bringing his disciples in, they were leaving their jobs. They were coming to join in a communal economic venture with Jesus. And so when he says, give to everyone who begs from you, and to everyone who wants to borrow from you, that is an injunction to bring everyone that you can, all the destitute, into this new communal life that they were beginning to live. So I really think it's more radical and less submissive than it sounds. I think that it's actually a program for civil disobedience, along the lines of a Martin Luther King or a Mahatma Gandhi.
And I was going to ask you that haven't we seen scholars and philosophers in the past who have used this portion of Sermon on the Mount to base their pacifist responses to aggression? And so you bring up Gandhi and King.
Yes. I think so. I think that both Gandhi and Martin Luther King are inspired by the New Testament for nonviolent action or nonviolent and non-cooperative action to resist oppressive power structures. Not necessarily passive, although maybe pacifist.
Okay.
Which I think is quite interesting, because when you talk about the non-violent, the pacifist ways of doing things, it also, when Christ did those things and when he talked about those things, he made the Romans and others, the Sanhedrin, for example, really angry, where they had to respond and they had to, they could not live with what he was saying.
Yeah, that's clear evidence that the way Jesus was living and the way he was having his disciples live, that it was threatening to the Roman Empire. The fact that not only did the Sanhedrin and the scribes, in fact, they basically formed a conspiracy against him to kill him.
Right.
Absolutely. They were uncomfortable. Any other comments on this? Well, then we move into Matthew chapter 6, and this starts off with the beautiful Lord's Prayer. And in here he's going to give us some advice on how to pray. And let's open our textbooks to page 15. And on page 15, we'll read some of these scriptures when he's giving us advice on how to pray. And let's start with verse 6. And Kisper, will you start reading for us? And I'll probably have you end somewhere around verse 15.
But thou, when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou hast shut thy door, pray to thy Father which is in secret. And thy Father which seeth in secret shall reward thee openly. But when ye pray, use not vain repetitions, as the heathen do, for they think that they shall be heard of for their much speaking. Be not ye therefore like unto them, for your Father knoweth what things you have need of, before ye ask him. After this manner therefore pray ye, Our Father which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done in earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
Okay, so Dennis, we have this prayer, and we've just been told to avoid vain repetition, but then why are we given this prayer? Is it meant to be the prayer that would always be given, or is it just kind of a sample prayer?
Well, I'm not certain about that, but notice vain repetition has the word vain in it. It's not an injunction against any repetition. Vain repetition is where you're not actually in tune with the intention behind the prayer. And so I don't think he's saying repetition in and of itself is problematic. I think we need to understand what we're repeating. I think ritual is important. It's important to repeat things, and to find all the meaning in those things that we repeat, whether they be actions, symbols in actions, or symbols in language. And I think in this case, there's a lot that goes on in the Lord's Prayer that it sort of encapsulates a lot of the intention behind the rest of the Sermon on the Mount.
Oh, what a wonderful comment. And I think that we really do need to underline that word vain repetition. Any other comments on this, on the Lord's Prayer, and how often it is beautiful literature as well as beautiful religion? Rhonda?
Well, when I read this, given what David just said, that I see it as in a manner of him showing me what I am supposed to be grateful for first, and that I can add on. Give us our daily bread just means, to me, the food that I eat, where it comes from, how I am able to get it. Not just that I have bread or manna. Manna would be something that all Jews would be familiar with, not because they had it, but because that was the Old Testament, in those kinds of things. But forgive us our debts as we forgive others. Again, it's this being able to be charitable towards each other, and not holding everything against another person.
Very good. And in fact, he follows up on this important point of forgiveness. So I liked your other points, but then he's going to follow up just another verse later and say on chapter 6, verses 14, 15, he says, if you forgive men their trespasses, your heavenly Father will forgive you. And then moves on and says, but if ye forgive not men their trespasses, neither will your Father in heaven forgive you of your trespasses. Luke, tell me a little bit about that. Why is it important to forgive?
It's interesting. There's a parable that goes along with this, with the servant who has been forgiven of his debt by his sovereign, and then he goes out and finds this guy who owes, the servant finds this other guy who owes him a debt, and demands his money, and when he doesn't have it, he has him thrown in prison. And it's given by Christ to teach us that basically in Christian theology that what we have isn't our own. It should be considered a blessing, something that's given to us from God, and so we don't really have any claims on anything. So it's very important for us to forgive others for for whatever it may be, because we don't really have any claims. He does.
Okay, thank you.
Can I make
Dennis,
a comment on that?
Please do, yes.
There's this view that a lot of people have, I think, in today's society, and a lot of Christians have this view that somehow we're rewarded materially and economically for our righteousness and for our hard work. And so if someone is wealthy, then it must be because they've worked really hard to attain that wealth. And if someone's poor, it must be because they're lazy. And I think that it's really clear that this view is undermined by the very idea that that we need to be forgiven, and also by the idea that, well, for example, in the Lord's Prayer, it's an economic prayer. If you look at it, if you look at the wording, it says that we're asking God to give us our daily bread. That's one of the three staples of the economy: food, shelter, and healthcare. And we're recognizing that we're dependent on God for what we have, and that it's not because we've done something to merit that, not because we've done something to earn it. And so for that reason also, we should forgive people who are indebted to us, because they may be indebted to us for reasons beyond their control. Debt is not something that is always the result of laziness. It could be the result of all sorts of circumstances that people have in society. And so I think it's important that the word debt is used here, and that we should be forgiving debts. It's an economic injunction, that we really ought to be living in an economic society that doesn't involve this idea of competition, and we earn whatever we have and we ought to keep it and hoard it.
And this is often part of what Jesus Christ is talking about, saying, who do you love more? Do you love God or money more? Who is your master? And he even talks about that in verse 19. And Luke, would you read verse 19 for us? Do 19, 20, 21.
Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust doth corrupt, and where thieves do not break through nor steal. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also.
You know, once again, Rhonda, this is very controversial. Can you tell me your thoughts regarding these verses that he just read to us?
Well, basically, you can't straddle the line. You can't have one foot in good and one in evil, so to speak.
Okay, and he's saying, hey, don't have these material possessions. They're not going to do you any good. How do you see it, Luke?
I think that's accurate. I think that he's talking about, where your focus is, where you spend your time. That's where your interest is going to be. And if you are spending all your time trying to accumulate wealth, there's not going to be much of an emphasis on God. And when the two are in the balance, you're probably going to choose, money over your religious beliefs. So it divides your focus in life.
Okay, and so Dennis, we have this beautiful prayer where we're told to forgive our debts as we forgive our debtors. We're told once again to forgive others, and we're told to not lay up treasures that wrath and moth can corrupt. Where is this applicable today? I mean, where we're being asked to forgive debts, and those are hard. That's hard to do.
Yeah.
And it's probably hard to do on a personal level as well as maybe even a national level, international.
I think it's important to note or to notice that the Christian message is not meant to just apply to people in their personal lives. It's meant to apply to groups of people, institutions, and even nations. And in the case of our economic system, our international economic system, the global economic system, we have a whole bunch of countries that are destitute. And hence, they're the ones who, according to Jesus' early sayings in the Beatitudes, they're the ones who are inherit the kingdom. But what we've got to do in order for that to happen is, I think, forgive the debt. There was a tradition in Jewish law anyway. Every 7 years, it was called Jubilee. Everyone's debts would be forgiven. And so in today's society, some prominent people who are concerned about this issue, like the lead singer of U2, Bono, and others, have joined a movement that's called the Jubilee Movement to put pressure on the big industrialized nations like the United States and the nations in the European Union to forgive the third world debt. And I think that they're motivated by Christian concerns in those cases, and it's a legitimate motivation. I think that if you were really following the Sermon on the Mount, the United States would have to forgive third world debt.
Okay, thank you.
Let me add one thing. Having money isn't necessarily an evil or a bad thing. In fact, you have to have in order to be able to give. And I think we need to keep that in mind, that unless you're a good steward of riches, of wealth, there is no way that you can help someone else.
Okay, so that's part of the formula. Anything you'd like to add to this, John?
Well, there's also a question of how you accumulate that wealth. Like Luke was saying, I mean, it does take, usually it takes time to accumulate that thing. And I think Jesus' point would be that you're serving two masters at that point. You're serving the wealth and the time you spend accumulating that and him, but even if you probably will end up favoring wealth, like Luke said again. But
we ought to ask ourselves how much of our day is contributed to living a Christian life and how much of our day is contributed to being a consumer. If you think of television as a text, we spend a lot more time reading the text of consumerism than we do reading our religious texts, Christian religious texts, because we sit there and watch these advertisements which tell us consume, consume, consume. And then we go out into the world, and when we're not working, that's what we're doing. We're consuming, consuming, consuming. So in today's society, I think this is very applicable. I think most people are trying to serve two masters, and they're doing it unsuccessfully.
Okay.
Or they're also, it's almost like they're in that situation against their will in some ways, because it's like, you need to spend 8 hours of your day working at a job so that you can feed your family, but then you're spending more time working than you are with your family.
Yeah.
And so, and if we're talking about, if a lot of this text is how we should treat each other and how we should think of ourselves and how we treat each other, what's more important than spending time with your kids?
Yeah.
At some point, you're completely neglecting your duties to your own children because of the amount of time you spend at work accumulating wealth.
Yeah, and this is important. I think it goes back to the fact that when Jesus first calls his disciples, he calls them away from their jobs. They leave.
They do.
And in fact, I think becoming a real disciple of Jesus at this time is about moving out of the commercialized economic system that the Romans had imposed on the Jews and into a new economic system, a community where people had all things in common.
And taking care of one another.
Yeah.
You're now talking about what kind of value am I creating for each other rather than what am I consuming from what the world offers.
Yes.
Kisper, a comment?
Well, and what value do you place on each of those things? People have to have a job to live in this world, but what value do you place on things? What do you put first in your life? What are your priorities?
Okay, thank you. And Luke, any comments on this, or a communitarian system here that we're moving into?
I think we covered it.
Okay. Well then, let's go ahead and look at the next scriptures that we have here, or the next verses that we have here. And we turn now to Matthew 6:25 through 33, and he's telling us to seek the kingdom of God over material things once again. And so he keeps reminding us on this, Dennis, just like you were mentioning. And would you mind reading that for us, John?
25 to 31, you said?
Uh-huh.
Therefore I say unto you, take no thought for your life, what ye shall eat, or what ye shall drink, nor yet for your body, what ye shall put on. Is not the life more than meat, and the body than raiment? Behold the fowls of the air, for they sow not, neither do they reap, nor gather into barns. Yet your heavenly Father feedeth them. Are ye not much better than they? Which of you by taking thought can add 1 cubit unto his stature? And why take ye thought for raiment? Consider the lilies of the field, how they grow. They toil not, neither do they spin. And yet I say unto you, that even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. Wherefore, if God so clothe the grass of the field, which today is, and tomorrow is cast into the oven, shall he not much more clothe you, O ye of little faith? Therefore take no thought, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or wherewithal shall we be clothed?
Okay, he says don't think about it. And in verses 33 and 34, he says, seek the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and these things will be added to you. And then the next thing he says, take no thought for the morrow shall take thought for the things of itself. Sufficient unto the day is the evil thereof. So are we being told that we're consuming way too much here, Dennis?
Yeah, I think it's even more radical than that. I don't think it's that they're saying, let's cut down on the amount of consumption that we make. Let's keep on going in this system, but just kind of calm down and spend a little bit less time at work. I think he's saying get rid of the system. The capitalist system. I think he's saying get rid of a system where you're forced to sell your labor power. and hence be alienated from your life. I think he's saying join a communal group where you share all things in common, and you only work when you need to or only work when you want to. Can I compare this a little bit to the Genesis story?
Sure.
In the Genesis story, which I don't think is a literal account of creation, I think its purpose is to tell us about the nature of work, because that's what God's doing. He's doing work for 6 days, and he rests on the seventh day. The seventh day is important because it tells us, hey, we should rest at some point. We should not always be working. But the kind of work that God does on the 6 days is creative work. It's not repetitive, laborious work on an assembly line. It's really interesting, very creative, artistic almost. And then we're told that we're made in the image of God. And it seems like to me, if we're made in the image of God, God's doing creative work. The kind of work that we ought to be doing is creative work as well, artistic work, that kind of work. But it's clear that's not what we're doing in society, or at least not very many of us. I think some people are successful at doing that kind of thing. But I really do think that this is radical in the sense that it undermines our system of economy. If we were to live according to this, we would not be able to be capitalists.
Okay, what do you think about that, Luke? Do you think that sometimes there is this clash between maybe capitalism, which would be seen as competitive, and this style of living, which would be seen as cooperative or communal?
I think there's definitely some conflict there. I don't know that I would say that it's necessarily a total rejection of capitalism. I would probably say that, it's difficult to. It's a lot of the same thing that we spoke about with the last few verses, that by focusing on how you're going to make money, how you're going to survive, your focus is not on what it should be on, as far as Christ is concerned. It's not on spiritual matters. It's on trying to get by. And he says, basically, don't worry about it. He says, you should create, you should contribute, you should do all those sorts of things, as Dennis was saying. But he's saying that focusing on how you're going to get by is not going to help you.
Sure. I mean, you can see how this advice would bankrupt the fashion industry, because he's saying, hey, the birds in the air, they don't wear beautiful raiment, beautiful clothing. Don't worry about these things. Rhonda and then John.
Well, I have to disagree a little bit. I think that true capitalism is misunderstood today. I don't think that capitalism is purely consumerism or purely competitivism. I think true capitalism is being able to exchange something of value for value. And if we were doing that, then that, would hold true to what's being said here. But I think that if we're purely consuming, and always having to have more, then that's not what Jesus Christ was teaching.
And if your whole life is based on material possessions that
Correct.
moths can eat up and that can be ruined by rust, he's saying it's going to be all gone. Instead, he really does want you to build character, and he wants you to build relationships, and remind you that the most important things will be these relationships, the love that we have. And it's definitely an ethic of love.
Exactly.
John?
I happen to agree with Dennis on this one. And I think that if in this discussion, I think we're leaving out the fact that he says, forgive us our debts. And I think that, if we're really to look at capitalism, debt is a huge part of how things run. And if we were to start practicing this Jubilee, then I think that if we really looked at it, capitalism would probably fail without debt to support it. And I think that just to kind of support what he's saying, if it undermines the system, I think we have to look at that. If we're talking about forgiving debts, I think that would have a huge impact on the system as we know it, the capitalist system.
Well, such a big part of debt is going to be interest, the interest that you pay on that debt. And this is also a strong Islamic objection. They don't like usury. They don't like the interest. And particularly for those of their own faith, they believe that if someone has to come and ask you for money, it's much better if you give them that money and expect it to be repaid. But how can you expect them to pay it back with interest if they already had to ask you for money?
Well, and that'll be an interesting topic when we get to business in capitalism. But I think here that Jesus Christ was also trying to tell us that God the Father He and God the Father are the ones who we owe everything to, that we will always be in their debt, that there's no way that we can ever do enough in this life, in order to be receivers of all the blessings, and that is why we have to forgive each other, that we have to, things that are intangible and tangible as well.
Thank you, that's a good point. And John brings up this point about Nietzsche, and then Rhonda's bringing up the point about forgiving and that kind of thing. How does Nietzsche have it right about this religion, or does he have it wrong? Because he's saying, you're doing all these things, it makes you very weak.
Yeah, it's both.
Yeah, well, I have a pretty strong opinion about this, since I side more with Christianity than I do with Nietzsche. But I think that Nietzsche makes some important criticisms of the way in which Christianity is used down the line. I think my view is that original Christian teaching becomes distorted once Christianity becomes the imperial power. In fact, I think that's actually a contradiction. The idea of Christianity being identified with the imperial power is impossible, because Christianity is fundamentally an opposition to an imperial power. The Roman Empire at that time, and I think now true Christians would be opposed to the American Empire. And so
wow, you are radical. These
well,
are wonderful
I think that they're analogous.
though.
I think the Roman Empire back then was analogous to the American Empire now. Even the neocons in office now say that there is an analogy. They call it the Pax Americana. And I think that a true Christian who's following the original teachings, who is opposed to the Roman Empire and its commercialization, would have to do the same thing about American globalization. And so, in my view, a lot of what passes for Christian teaching throughout the Middle Ages, and a lot of what Nietzsche criticizes in Christian teaching throughout the Middle Ages, is not really true Christianity. So, for example, the part that we talked about that sounded very submissive, Nietzsche would criticize that, but notice the way I read it, it doesn't sound submissive. It now sounds like non-cooperation. In fact, it almost sounds powerful to take all your clothes off in public and to be disobedient. That's a pretty powerful act. It's a kind of a Nietzschean act.
Yeah, to break the law. To say, I'm going to go another mile with you, and that's breaking the law, and you're going to look bad. You're going to suffer. You made me do it. So, Luke, thoughts on our radical turn here?
It's radical. I don't know.
How about you, Kisper? Just soaking it all in?
Soaking it all in. I have never thought of it from this aspect.
With the radical.
You're such a brilliant scholar, Dennis, and you've been studying this for such a long time, and I think these are new concepts for the students. So, any thoughts over here? Yeah, John.
If I could just comment real quick on what Dennis is saying. I think that he's right in the way he's reading these texts as being kind of Nietzschean in a way. And Nietzsche's not really going to criticize exactly what is said in these. He's going to criticize the way they were used, and almost the way they were used to create a system that is going to lead us away from values such as these in some ways. I mean, Nietzsche's a little bit more harsh than that. But I just want to say that, I like that reading, and I don't think that Nietzsche's necessarily going to criticize that reading either. But.
And I think this topic is going to be very open throughout the rest of class, because we will be studying business ethics, and I think that it'll be very important to come back to this Christian notion, and perhaps we can even bring you back when we're doing this discussion on business ethics and tie it directly into some of the principles there when we do Marx's view on capitalism. Then we will be bringing in Pierre Lamarche. And so, but maybe we can have you come in and make some other comments on how this might tie in with American business today and American business and American government and some of those areas where you need a whole class period, I think.
Yeah.
I think Rhonda's got one more comment, and then I think we'll start winding up this class. Okay.
No, the only thing I was going to say was that, some of the writings of Nietzsche that I've read, I wonder if he's got tongue in cheek sometimes. I realize that he's touted as a atheist. But some of the times I've wondered if he was actually a little bit closer to Christianity than any of us really know.
Interesting comment. Interesting comment.
Can I make one last comment about the text?
Yes, you can, because we're going to move right on into building your how you build your life. Do you build it on sand or do you build it on a foundation?
Oh, okay.
So
should I make the comment now?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that one thing that we need to remember when we're reading a Christian text like this is that it might not only be injunctions to us as persons or as individuals, but it might also be an injunction to society, an injunction to the community. And we need to realize that sin can be not just an individual or a personal thing, but it can be a communal thing. And so, because of that, grace and our salvation from sin also has to be something that occurs at the communal level.
That's a very strong comment on this text, and I think a very necessary one, because it does come back to salvation. And let's finish it up where it does tie these concepts together. Matthew 7:24-29, and Kisper, if you could read that for us, please. It talks about where our foundation should be.
Therefore, whosoever heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them, I will liken him unto a wise man, which built his house upon a rock. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell not, for it was founded upon a rock. And every one that heareth these sayings of mine, and doeth them not, shall be likened unto a foolish man, which built his house upon the sand. And the rain descended, and the floods came, and the winds blew, and beat upon that house, and it fell, and great was the fall of it. And it came to pass, when Jesus had ended these sayings, the people were astonished at his doctrine, for he taught them as one having authority, not as the scribes.
You know, that's such a lovely way to end this class period too, where he's saying, these are my teachings, and it might be easier to build your lives on other concepts. It might be much easier to enjoy capitalism, but he's saying, here, I expect you to love one another. I expect you not to get angry. I expect you to forgive people, and I expect you to do good to the poor. And we find that he really is privileging his philosophy and people who he expects to follow it. Next time, we'll talk about Hobbes. So thanks for being here with us today. Bye-bye.